So, in thinking about Jesus Christ this afternoon, then there's, I think, a series of things which are accepted to be true about the historical man Jesus, that he actually existed. There was someone by the name of Jesus who was a prominent teacher, living sometime around 30 AD in Israel. And many people are happy to accept he taught a good brand of morality. Some of his most famous teachings were you should love your neighbor, but also love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He allowed the children to come to him. He had quite progressive attitudes towards the treatment of women. Um, People are quite happy, perhaps, to accept, yeah, he was a real man and he taught some nice things, and I'm aboard with that. And also, it's a historical fact. He was sentenced to death and crucified. It's pretty small down the bottom here, but there's Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, Jewish, although he switched sides and joined the Roman army around the time of the wars of the Jews and the overthrow of Israel. But also a Roman historian, Tacitus. They both write independently about the historical man, the teacher, Jesus, the Christ, who was put to death and crucified by the Romans. So far, so historically accepted, I think. I don't think anyone really doubts there really was a person called Jesus who lived and taught and died. But here's the question for Christians. Do we also have to accept this idea that he came back from the dead? Is it not possible to accept the first three of those without this supernatural kind of paranormal element to it? Can we not accept his teaching and his lifestyle as an example to us without also accepting this idea that he came back from the dead? Well, let's just follow that train of thought. Would it be a problem, do you think, to accept only the first three statements and not the fourth? What if we discounted the fourth? Well, what did Jesus himself say? There's a series of three passages here, all from Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus bases his own personal credibility upon this idea that he would be raised from the dead. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. A little later in Matthew's Gospel, the Son of Man, that's a way Jesus uses to describe himself, is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day. See, we are going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests to be crucified, and he will be raised on the third day. And the point is this, if we're going to discount his resurrection from the dead, then we have to discount some of the things that Jesus taught about himself. And we'd have to say, I suppose, maybe he was mistaken. In fact, he didn't rise from the dead on the third day. Or something a bit more sinister. He was a fraud or a trickster of some sort. You're making these outlandish claims about himself, which actually were not true. And what does that do for Jesus' personal credibility, both at the time with his own disciples and with us reading about him now 2,000 years later? This is a quote from C.S. Lewis. I like how succinctly he presents this dilemma. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. And so what C.S. Lewis is saying is really that middle ground of, yes, he was a real man. Yes, he was a great teacher, but no, he wasn't the Son of God. that middle ground, that fence-sitting position, is not really left open to us. Either you accept the things that Jesus taught and the implications of those teachings, or you disregard it altogether. You say, well, he's either a madman making these claims, or he's some sort of con artist, and so we don't respect him or follow him. That's C.S. Lewis's argument, and it's something very similar. I think if you're in 1 Corinthians 15, or can turn back there, I think something very similar obviously emerges from what the Apostle Paul writes to the believers in Corinth. Um, the resurrection of the dead is discussed in both the Old and the New Testament, but if there's one place that is the resurrection chapter, then it's this, 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul argues this is one of the fundamental things of the gospel that I have taught you, believers in Corinth. That's how he started in verse 3. I delivered to you as of first importance Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. He was buried and he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. And more than that, he appeared after his resurrection to a whole list of people that we'll think about in a second. Now, if some of you in Corinth are doubting the reality of the resurrection from the dead, let's just walk through the consequences of that in verse 12. If there's no resurrection of the dead, then obviously Christ has not been raised. But if Christ has not been raised in verse 14, our preaching is in vain and our faith is in vain. Frankly, what hope is there if the man that we look to, our Savior, the man that we called Lord, if he was condemned and killed as a common criminal, crucified by the Romans, and only spared from the rubbish heap by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, having him buried in the tomb with some respect and dignity, if that's our Savior, if that's what the gospel is all about, then frankly, the conclusion is, at the end of verse 19, we are of all people most to be pitied. And again, this kind of middle road of we respect Jesus' teachings, but he didn't rise from the dead. Paul says, I've got no time for that. Frankly, we have no hope and our faith is in vain and it's futile if there's no such thing as the resurrection. So it becomes one of the most important questions then for Christians. Can we accept this idea that resurrection from the dead is a real thing? Let's just assume for a moment, let's just park the idea that the resurrection could actually happen. And I just want to walk you through, this is going to be fairly small, but I'll guide you through it on the slide. How else might we explain the events surrounding the death of Jesus? Because we accept the historical reality of his death. So how else might we explain the events surrounding the claims of his resurrection other than by it actually happening? So that's how we start at the top. If the dead are not raised, then it's quite small. Why did the disciples preach Jesus had been raised from the dead? Okay, let's assume for a second Jesus had not come back from the dead. Why are his disciples going around saying that he has? What reason have they got to say that? I think there's one of two things it could be. Either, well, they know he hasn't come back from the dead, but for some reason they decide they're going to preach that anyway. That's one branch. The other is something has happened that has convinced them he has come back from the dead. It's going to have to be something pretty remarkable to convince them. Nonetheless, maybe something has convinced them, even though there's no such thing as the resurrection from the dead. Okay, so let me walk you through this slide then. So on the left-hand side first, the disciples know he hasn't come back from the dead, but they've come up with this scheme, this plan. They're going to tell people that he has. Why might they do that? I suppose they could say, this is something Jesus himself taught, and we're going to try and salvage his reputation because he claimed he'd come back from the dead. So we're going to say that he actually has to keep up his reputation and his teaching. Okay, but then you have to do something with the body, don't you? Everyone has seen, publicly, Jesus has been crucified. Everyone knows Jesus has died and he's been buried in the tomb. Clearly, you can't go around saying he's risen from the dead and leave his body in the tomb. You're going to have to do something about the body. And why begin preaching in Jerusalem? Well, think about that in a second as well. That's a really key question, I think. Let's just think about the body. So I suppose we could say, well, the disciples had to steal the body as part of this plan to say Jesus is back from the dead. Clearly, they have to move it. Does that seem likely? Is that something the disciples were motivated to do? Just have a look at Matthew chapter 27 for me. Because this possibility had already occurred to Jesus' enemies. At the end of chapter 27 of Matthew, verse 62, the next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember how that impostor," speaking of Jesus, "how that impostor said while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise.'" So again, these were public statements Jesus made. He rested his public credibility upon these statements. "After 3 days I will rise," and his enemies remember he said that. 64. "Therefore order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead. And the last fraud will be worse than the first." So it occurs to us the disciples might want to come and steal the body. So Pilate, can we guard the tomb until the third day, until this period of time has passed that Jesus claimed he would return? And so they have soldiers and they seal the stone and set a guard. Now in chapter 28, the events of the resurrection morning are described by Matthew. And those soldiers who had supposed to be guarding the tomb and who had fallen down like dead men in verse 4, when the angel appears, they've got to go back and make a report. And in verse 11 of chapter 28, while they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep." Even though this possibility occurred to us before, and this is why, specifically, this is why we had some soldiers guarding the tomb, you are to tell people, nonetheless, that is what has happened. And I really want you to just take note. This is the best alternative explanation that Jesus' enemies are able to come up with. The disciples are going around saying Jesus has actually come back from the dead. His enemies need an alternative explanation for the tomb being empty. The best story they have is the disciples must have come and taken it. Soldiers, that's the story you are to put out. Verse 15, so they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. So when Matthew is writing his gospel in, I don't know exactly, AD 60s, AD 70s, somewhere around there, even those decades later, that is still the best explanation Jesus' enemies have for the tomb being empty. Now, does that seem something like the disciples are likely to do? So we're to believe that they overpowered the guards, they rolled away the stone, they took Jesus' body, and then began to preach the resurrection, facing persecution and death, as is described in the book of Acts and in the history of the persecution of Christians. preaching a gospel they knew for a fact to be a lie. What motivation have they got to do that? Does that seem likely? Just think about all these statements about their state of mind. When Jesus was arrested, they laid their hands on Jesus and seized him, and they all left him and fled. That's Jesus' disciples. They all left him and fled. Remember, Peter denies he has any association with Jesus around this time. Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. I do not know this man of whom you speak. And immediately the cock crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. On the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the door being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews. The disciples are afraid for their lives. And they're not soldiers. They're a group of fishermen and a tax collector. Yeah, true, Peter had been prepared to swing a sword in Jesus' defense, but they are not in the state of mind where they're prepared to overpower the guards and steal the body and make a march on Jerusalem. So this idea that they stole the body seems pretty unlikely to me. Okay, well, maybe someone else moved it then. Someone else took the body. Well, who and why? If it's a friend, it's maybe Joseph of Arimathea moved the body for some reason. Well, surely he would tell the disciples he'd moved it, especially when they go around saying Jesus has been risen from the dead. And if an enemy moved it, if the soldiers or the Pharisees or someone moved it, they would just produce the body and say he's not raised from the dead, and here's the body. So this isn't really an adequate explanation either. I'll just mention this briefly. It's so ridiculous to be discounted very quickly, but every so often you hear the suggestion, well, maybe after being flogged and being too weak to carry his own cross and being crucified and hanging on the cross for several hours and then having a spear thrust into his side and then wrapped head to toe in grave clothes and then placed into a tomb, after all of that, he wasn't actually dead, and he was able to free himself from the grave clothes, roll back the stone, overpower the guards, and do what? Like, allow his disciples to go and preach that he's back from the dead, even though he never actually died. This is so preposterous, as we're going to remove it from the slide pretty quickly. But then, also that leaves you with the disciples preaching a gospel that they know is not true because Jesus hasn't actually died, and why would they preach that? And it doesn't answer any questions either. So let's get rid of that. Okay, so let's work our way down the right-hand side then. Something has happened that has convinced the disciples that Jesus has been raised from the dead. So what could that be? Why would they think that he is alive again? What would it take to convince them? Are we thinking of the sort of straw clutching desperation to see Jesus, of the kind of people who post the face of Jesus in a piece of toast on the internet, or I saw Jesus' face in the clouds, any sort of implausible little scrap of evidence that maybe he's alive? Is that what we're talking about here? Again, let's think about their state of mind. Okay, his body has gone. Is that fact in and of itself enough to convince them that he's alive again? And that doesn't answer the question, where has his body gone? You still have to come back to the left-hand side, but just ignoring that for a moment, does the mere fact that the tomb is empty convince them he's back from the dead? This is John's account of the resurrection. Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Notice that? She doesn't say, Jesus is not here, so he must be alive. No, she says, Jesus is not here, his body has been moved somewhere by someone. That's a far more reasonable conclusion to jump to, isn't it? In fact, when she does, in fact, see Jesus in a second, even then she assumes that it isn't Jesus, that the body has been moved. Okay, well, so the tomb is empty and they thought they'd seen him. Let's think about some of these claimed sightings of Jesus after his resurrection. This is later on in the same chapter. Having said this, Mary turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." You notice that? Her assumption is his body is not there because someone's moved it, not his body's not there because he's back from the dead. Even when she's talking to Jesus, she says, "If you've moved the body, tell me where it is." Again, it's a far more reasonable assumption to make than he'd come back from the dead, even though Jesus had predicted beforehand that that was what was going to happen. How about in Mark's gospel? So that's Mary Magdalene in the garden. She goes back and tells the disciples. When he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. And that has a ring of truth, doesn't it? Mary, Mary, you're upset. We're all, been shocked and upset by the events of the last few days. Of course, Jesus is not alive. He's crucified. He's laid in the tomb. You're overwhelmed. They will not believe her. Just side note, if this was a conspiracy on the part of the disciples to make up this story about the resurrection, you definitely would not cast Mary Magdalene as your first witness to the risen Jesus. A woman, I mean, first of all, in itself, at that time, you wouldn't rely upon the testimony of a woman. And you certainly wouldn't rely upon the testimony of a woman with a known history of mental illness. You would cast someone respectable from, upstanding member of the council like Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus or any of the other prominent disciples of Jesus. And you say, well, they are our primary witnesses to the resurrection, if this was a story you were going to make up. But no, they say it was Mary Magdalene. And by the way, we didn't even believe her when she first told us. Later on, Jesus appears to two walking in the country. They went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Now, Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came, so the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." Because the disciples have this perfectly understandable skepticism about these claims of people to have seen Jesus. They are demoralized. After 3 years following him around, listening to his teachings, and then seeing him arrested in the garden, taken by force, put to death and executed, and placed into the tomb, they know for a fact he is dead. It is going to take a lot to convince them that he is alive again. And that's a natural reaction, isn't it? That's an understandable reaction of the disciples to these events. When Jesus does appear, he stood among them and said to them, "Peace to you." They were startled and frightened and thought they saw a spirit. Even then, they don't assume, great, this is Jesus back from the dead, appearing in the middle of the room. They assume this is his ghost appearing to us. And in fact, Jesus has to convince them, touch me and see, a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. And they're still disbelieving and were marveling. He said to them, well, give me something to eat then. Let me prove to you, I am not a ghost. I am really here in the flesh. You can touch me, as Thomas had said that he wanted to do. They are going to need some convincing he really is back from the dead. This is not the disciples desperate to latch onto any flimsy, I saw Jesus' face in the crowd, or I saw someone that looks like Jesus walking in the street. This is multiple appearances that they are claiming to overcome their understandable reluctance to believe he really can be back from the dead. They claim multiple appearances with him, including in John chapter 21, eating breakfast with him. Now, what motivation have they got? Again, assuming this is not because Jesus actually has come back from the dead. We're trying to imagine how else might we explain all these events other than the resurrection being a real thing. Why would they claim all of this? Why would they claim to have seen him? Well, maybe they made the story up. Maybe they agreed between them, this is the story that we're going to put out, that Mary saw him first, and then Jesus appeared to two on the road, and then again, that takes you back to the start on the left-hand side. Okay, so why make the story up then? What motivation have they got for doing that? Well, maybe they'd gone mad. I mean, all of them, including people who were previously hostile to Jesus. So if not necessarily hostile, Jesus' own family were certainly not supportive of his teaching. And yet, Jesus' half-brother James becomes one of the leading figures in the early church in the book of Acts. It's possible that Jesus' half-brother also wrote the book known as James. And Paul, the author of First Corinthians, he definitely was hostile to the teaching of Jesus. And yet he became one of the most prominent advocates and missionaries for the gospel of Jesus Christ that there was. Something has happened that has convinced even his enemies. We're not just talking about people sympathetic to Jesus' teaching who have become convinced of his resurrection. People who were outright enemies of Jesus have become convinced of his resurrection. Something has happened that has completely changed their attitude toward Jesus. These are the verses in the middle in 1 Corinthians 15 we didn't read. He appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, the disciple, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And you hear the implication there. Dear Corinthians, if you still doubt the truth of the resurrection, you can go and speak to some of these 500 people. Most of them are still alive. Now, if this is all a conspiracy that's been cooked up by the disciples, why would you be inviting, go and speak to the majority of 500 witnesses if you know this is actually not true? Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. So I think that's referring to James, Jesus' brother. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. That's Paul writing. To me, someone who had been one of the fiercest persecutors of the early Christians that there was. Jesus appeared to me. Something has happened to Paul that has completely altered his relationship with Jesus and to the gospel of Jesus. And so we're left with at least these questions, I think. If the dead are not raised, why did the disciples begin preaching that he had come back from the dead? And why in Jerusalem? The very place where Jesus had been arrested only 6, 7 weeks before. He had been arrested and put to death. You wouldn't begin preaching in Jerusalem. You go to the north, go to Galilee. Jesus had been far better received in Capernaum and Cana and around the towns around Galilee, Tiberias. Go and start preaching there. Begin the movement there, not in Jerusalem, in the very heart of where his enemies are strongest. And why suffer and die for the sake of a story they knew wasn't true? There's just no motivation for them to do that. What happened to Jesus' body? Why were Paul and Jesus' brother converted to the cause? Again, why cast Mary Magdalene as the first witness to the resurrection? If you're going to make this up, say Joseph of Arimathea was the first. And how did the preaching continue to be so successful? Is this a conspiracy that somehow has been held together by this group of disciples despite the pressure of persecution and facing death as they were for the sake of this story? Are we really to believe that the conspiracy was held together under that kind of stress in the early church? And why are so many people converted to the cause if it's just not true at its heart? Or is it actually more plausible that the real explanation for the events surrounding the death of Jesus is that he really did appear to James. He really did appear to Paul. He really did appear to Thomas and the disciples and convince them of his resurrection. That now actually seems like the least unlikely explanation for the events that we read in the Gospels and in Acts. And maybe it's true, as Paul says, in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead. And he is only the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. So not only is Jesus a real historical figure, a great teacher, not only was he put to death by the Romans, but he really came back from the dead as well. And in so doing, gives hope that his followers can be raised from the dead as well. Thank you very much.